Hey folks, welcome to week 3 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. How is everybody? Hope you're doing well. Alright, so we are continuing along with Photoshop this week. Let's go down to Module 3 for week 3 here and see what the heck we're doing. Okay, so last time around in week 2 we started working with basics of compositing, and we did our scene from Venice using really simple compositing tools like the layers palette and the eraser tool. And we sort of kept it simple and just sort of put together images from different places into a new composite image. So now this week we're going to move into the idea of selections and masks. Now, similar to the eraser tool, selections and masks allows you to eliminate certain things from photographs, as well as sort of make more specific selections. The difference is that while the eraser tool is a little sort of rough and doesn't have a lot of nuance, there are a variety of selection tools, and they can be used really specifically with a lot of detail. And selections are really important in using Photoshop for a variety of reasons. So we're going to get into that this week. So if we look at the module here, the main goal, of course, is to demonstrate a variety of tools and ways that we can make selections. So we're going to do that here in the video, and then we'll do a little later on in the week as well. So you'll have a few opportunities to see this in action, and then, of course, your main goal is to practice with it, right? We'll talk about the importance of practicing and mastering the selection tool and the refinement process, and we're going to get into the history panel a little bit this week, although we'll be using that more as we go along. And then for a different perspective on how to use selection tools outside of my own point of view, you can watch this video here, How to Cut Out Anything in Photoshop. This is actually a really great video, so that'll give you some other ways to go about it. Now, the specific tools in Photoshop we're going to be using are the marquee tools, the lasso tools, the magic wand tool, the quick selection tool, and a little later on in the week we'll talk about channels and paths, quick mask mode, and like I said, the history panel. So we're going to sort of do this half and half this week because there's a lot to cover, okay? There is a quiz this week, remember. It is due by the end of the week. Check the due date on quiz 1. As you know by now, all the quizzes are basically step-by-step timed quizzes that you are supposed to just do and get them done so that you follow the directions. So the layer basics is the first one, and that one, of course, we're doing in the same technique that we did the scene from Venice in, using the layers palette and the eraser tool. So make sure you get the layer basics quiz done this week, okay? Also, later on in the week, we are going to introduce our very first project, a retro movie poster, but we're not going to deal with that today. We'll get to that a little bit later, okay? All right, so let's dive into selections and masks in Photoshop. All right. So one thing you should know is that there are a bunch of practice files for this. So if you go over to Files on Canvas, and since we are in week 3, go down to the week 3 folder, and you'll see here that there's a bunch of stuff. We're going to get to quick mask mode, add a mask, and clipping layers with type later in the week, so ignore those for now. But for any time during the week while you're practicing with selections, I gave you a whole bunch of photographs under week 3 demo images, and you can practice with any of these. I'm going to use a few of them right here, right now, to sort of show you how this works, okay? All right, so let's hop over to Photoshop. All right, so here we are in Photoshop, and you probably recognize the photo of this woman. I showed you this a couple weeks ago. And so the reason why I'm starting with her is because I want to show you sort of the nuance of some of the selection tools and how they work. We demonstrated a little bit of this in the first week, but we're going to really get deeper into the selection tools now. Okay, so good rule of thumb in Photoshop, as I've mentioned before, is before you start working on any photograph, you have to unlock it. Otherwise, you won't be able to see the transparency behind it. So make sure you go over to the layers palette here and double click on the thumbnail, and that gives you an opportunity to name the layer, number 1, which is always good practice. But when you hit OK, the layer has been unlocked, and now the image is free to move around. Remember we did this, and we have all this air behind us. Now, the ability to have the transparency behind the photograph is important, and to keep it unlocked so that when we use the selection tools to either select an area or delete an area, we can just get to the transparency, which is what we want. We don't want any flat colors coming in behind us. Okay, so one basic thing is let's see where the selection tools are in the toolbar. So over here in the upper left corner naturally is the move tool, which is the tool we are using right now to sort of pick things up and move them around, right? But to the immediate right of that is the rectangular marquee tool. Now, marquee is the name of these types of tools. I don't really know why it's called marquee, but what it does is it makes those dotted line animated selections. And if you hold down on the tool, you'll see that there are a number of other tools underneath it. There's the rectangular marquee tool, which we're going to use in a second, and the elliptical marquee tool, which is the second one down. Now there's two others. There's a single row marquee tool and a single column marquee tool that make really thin selections either in a vertical line or horizontal line. They don't really get used a whole lot. They're not super useful. So we're going to skip over them and we're going to stick with the rectangle and the ellipse. Okay, so just to show you how these work, you choose the tool you want. So we choose the rectangular tool. And then when I bring my cursor over here to the image, you'll see that my cursor has changed to a little crosshairs, right? You see that? And then if I were to simply click and drag out a rectangle and then let it go, you'll see that I get those marching ants, right? I showed you this a couple weeks ago. You've got the marching ants. And once you've created the marching ants, the area inside that animated dotted line is active, meaning that if I were to make any photographic changes to this, or if I were to paint over it, it would just happen inside the dotted lines. Now, I demonstrated that a couple weeks ago. I'm going to show you again real quick. If I were to grab the paintbrush tool and just paint over the area, you'll notice that outside of the dotted line, I can't paint anything. Nothing happens. I just am doing nothing. But then if I paint inside of it, I can actually paint inside of it. And of course, if I go from the outside through the inside, it only paints inside the marching ants, inside the box. Now, the other thing, of course, you can do inside the active area is make photographic changes. So if I go to Image and I go to Adjustments and I go to, say, Hue and Saturation, I can change the coloring inside that rectangle that I made. And I can change it either by adjusting the hue, the saturation, the lightness, and so on and so forth. And everything I've done has happened inside the rectangle. So again, inside the marching ants, active. Outside the marching ants, not active. What else can I do with the marching ants? Well, if I switch from the marquee tool to the move tool, I can pick it up and move it, and it takes all of the pixels that were inside that marching ant rectangle and moves them as well. So I can take it somewhere else and just drop it off. And of course it leaves nothing but transparency behind. The other thing I can do with it is if I go up to Edit and go to Copy, and the keyboard command for that is Command or Control C, which is a common keyboard command. You probably know that one already. So if I go to Copy, and then I go to my Layers palette over here, and click the New Layer button right next to the trash can, and then I can go ahead and do Paste, because I'm on a new layer, right? Remember, I'm on a new layer. So go to Edit and then Paste. It drops off what was inside the marching ants on a new layer. So I'm going to shut off the back layer by just shutting off the eyeball. And look, there's just that rectangle with that part of her face in it, right? So you can copy paste anything that's inside the marching ants. Okay, so let's move back a little bit here. Okay, what else can I do with the marching ants, right? So I can make adjustments inside of it, either by painting or by making photographic adjustments. I can remove pieces of the photograph. I can copy and paste pieces of the photograph to different layers. Other things I can do is I can treat the marching ants like a cookie cutter, right? You've all seen cookie cutters. Put it down on a piece of dough, you put some pressure on it, and then it removes that piece of dough in that shape so that you can make cookies out of it or whatever else. Well, if while the ants are marching here, while that dotted line is animated, if I go ahead and hit delete on my keyboard, just the delete key, and boom, it permanently deletes all of the pixels that were inside that rectangle. So they're gone, okay? And I would like to point out that everything we're doing here is what we call destructive editing, meaning that once it's done, if I were to shut down Photoshop and come back to the same file, it's gone for good. So we'll talk about non-destructive in a couple of weeks, but first I'm just teaching you how this works. So the only way to go backwards now is to undo, right? You can do Control or Command Z, okay? And that'll take you backwards in time so you can undo what you just did. Now, of course, this doesn't just work with rectangles, and it doesn't obviously just work in that one spot. If I go back to the marquee tool and then put it in the center, I can move the marquee anywhere I want, right? If I go up to the File menu here, you'll see that one of the choices is Select. These tools here affect selections. That's why it's called Select. So that allows me to change the selection to a certain degree. So one of the things I can do is I can transform it. If I just go to Transform Selection, it'll put what's called a bounding box around this. Now let's talk about what a bounding box is for a second, because you're going to see these over and over again in the Adobe software, right? All a bounding box is a control box, and you'll see that it has little squares in all four corners on the top and the bottom and the two sides. And these allow you to click on those squares. Those are called anchor points, and you can pick something up and resize it. If you just grab the corner and move it up and down, it'll resize it but keep it proportionate. If I grab the end, same thing. But now if I were to hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, while I'm doing that, it makes it malleable, and I can not only resize it, but I can also reshape it. So I can make it a completely different shape. I can stretch it out, and again, if I hold down the Shift key, I can elongate it or make it this way. So this allows me to change the selection. Now this is important because you might not always get your selection right the first time just by drawing it out, so you want to be able to make some adjustments to it, right? If you want to get it just in a certain way, you can play around with it until you're totally happy with it. Once you're happy with the size and shape of it, simply hit Return on your keyboard, just hit the Return key, and it makes the bounding box go away. The selection is no longer adjustable, but the selection itself remains. Okay. Now, there's other things we can do in the Select menu that pulls down here. One of the most popular things to do is inverse, which means to change the area that is selected. So again, as I said, everything inside the rectangle is active. Everything outside the rectangle is inactive. What if I wanted to reverse that and I wanted to just select everything around the rectangle and leave the inside of the rectangle untouched? Easiest way to do that is go to Select, go to Inverse, and now it reverses it. How do I know it reversed the selection? Well, the rectangle looks the same, but you'll notice that now the perimeter of the image has a marching dotted line around it, the marching ants. So that tells me that everything out here is active, but everything in here is not active. And if I were to go ahead and hit the Delete key on the keyboard, like we did earlier, now it gets rid of the background. Now that's a very useful tool. Even though it's destructive editing, it's a very useful tool because sometimes we want to get rid of backgrounds, right? If I wanted to trim out the shape of this woman, her hair down past her hand, all the way around her neck here, over her shirt, I could then go ahead and delete out this background that is behind her and make her sort of a free-floating character. Now I can't do that with this rectangular marquee tool, but there are other selection tools that will do that. We're going to take a look at those in a minute. Now, if you want to get rid of the marching ants, right, you're all done with them, you have to deselect them. Now, you can either go up to the selection menu, select, and just go to deselect, but this is a really good task to know the keyboard command for, so you're going to want to do Command or Control D. Command if you're on a Mac, Control if you're on a PC. It's the same keyboard command otherwise. So Command D or Control D, and it makes the marching ants go away, and you're all set. Okay, so that's one way to work with marquee tools in the rectangular sense. Now you might want to pause the video, go practice with that, and then come back. I'll wait. Okay, hey, you're back. All right, so let's look at another one. So underneath the rectangular marquee tool was the elliptical marquee tool. Now an ellipse, of course, is an oval, right, which can become a circle. And I am going to use the magnifying glass tool here and zoom in. And I showed you this a little bit the first week using a different selection tool, but I'm going to use the elliptical tool here. So let's say, for example, that I want to change the color of her eye, right? Well, if I click and drag the elliptical tool, you'll see that it makes oval, or if I hold down the Shift key while I'm doing it, it makes a perfectly round shape. Now that doesn't do me a whole lot of good like that, but I just wanted to sort of show you that you can do round or elliptical shapes this way. Now, what I can do, of course, is just try to outline her eye by go ahead and enlarging it this way. And then once I've got that done, remember I can go to select, I can go to transform selection, it'll give me that bounding box, and then that gives me a chance to resize it so that it's more appropriate for the actual shape of her eye. Remember, if you want to squish it, hold down the shift key while you're doing it, and you can get it to be approximately the right size. And then from there, we can go ahead and make some changes. So take some time, play around with it. You have to be super patient with these tools to get things just right. Okay, then go ahead and hit return on your keyboard to make the bounding box go away. Okay, so now we've got the eye selected like this. We're going to make a couple of adjustments to it. So let's talk a little bit about feathering, right? What feathering is it gives something sort of a fuzzy edge. And you're probably thinking like, well, why do I need to make this selection? Why do I need to make the edge of this selection fuzzy? Well, it's because in real life, there are very few things that have actual hard edges. Sure, if you're talking about a piece of stainless steel or something, it definitely has a nice hard edge. But, you know, humans, trees, animals, most things in life are kind of fuzzy, right? The edges are squishy or fuzzy. And more importantly, not so much that they physically feel that way, but they appear that way, right? So we're zoomed in at 300% here, taking a look at the photo of this woman. And right, if you look at the edge of her neck over here, or the bottom of her ear, it's not a crisp line, right? It's kind of fuzzy and blurry, and the colors from the ear kind of start blurring into the colors of her hair. And then even if we zoom back and look at her at a more realistic distance, here we are at 100%, the same is true of pretty much everything, right? If you look at the edge of her hand over here, the edge of her neck over here, right? Talk about the top of her hair or whatnot, nothing is really a hard line. And that's because of how the human eyeball works, right? There is always a point of focus, and then the rest of it is generally out of focus. So in this case, the only part of her that's really super in focus is around her nose and a little bit on each eyeball. So that's sort of the center of focus right here. And then everything else, as we start to radiate outwards, gets blurrier and blurrier, right? And then also, if there were other things in the photograph, if there was like a tree in the background or a house or something, that would probably be out of focus too, because it's further away. So that's what we refer to as a depth of field. If you've ever taken a photography class, you'll know that there's sort of a line, which is that z-axis that we talked about in class of 3-dimension that is closest to you, the viewer, and then gets further and further away. And somewhere along that line, your subject, the thing you're looking at, is in focus, and then it goes out of focus again. So anyway, why am I telling you all this? Because generally when you're dealing with photographs and you're making changes in photographs, you don't want to work with super crisp lines because it feels unrealistic. So what we want to do here is, even though we've made this nice oval selection of her eyeball, right, and we want to change the color of her eye, which is what we're going to do, we need to go up here to select, where we've been before, and we're going to go down to modify. And you'll see there's a bunch of modifiers, but we're going to just go right to feather. Now, the feathering menu is not very complex. It really only gives you the ability to adjust it by a certain number of pixels. Now, unless you know the exact pixel density of the photograph, which I could show you the math on how to do it, but it's unnecessary work, you're better off just sort of starting out with a low number and going from there. And I'll show you what it does. I'm going to leave it really high at 15 pixels and watch what happens to our selection, right? See, it compresses it downwards, right? And what that does is it basically means that the edge of this selection is going to be really fuzzy, probably more fuzzy than we need it to be. So I'm going to go back in time here just by doing Control-Z, and then I'm going to go back up to select, back to modify, back to feather. And instead of 15, which is a lot, we're going to make it just like 2 pixels, which doesn't seem like a lot. And when I go ahead and hit OK, you're going to see that this selection barely moves, but that is just enough to make the edge of the selection fuzzy enough so that whatever photographic changes we make look realistic. Okay, so now I'm going to go up to Image, go back to Adjustments, go back to Hue and Saturation like we did earlier, and I'm just going to slide through the colors, and we're going to give her a different eye color. Maybe it should look good with a nice purple eye color. And we can saturate it a little bit more and brighten it up a smidge. And now go ahead and hit OK, and hit Deselect. And now we've changed her eye color to purple. And you'll notice because we added the fuzzy edge that it blends nicely into that darker edge of her eye and looks a little more realistic. And of course, you'll notice that by making the changes photographically as opposed to painting over it, that things like these white highlights on the front of her eyeball don't get changed. So that works out pretty nicely. So now when we zoom back, she has a purple eye. Okay, let's look at some other selection tools, okay? So we talked about the rectangular selection tool and the elliptical selection tool. Let's take a look at this next set of selection tools, which is right underneath the move tool. And you'll see either the lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool, or maybe even the magnetic lasso tool. All three of them live together underneath each other. This is our set of 3 lasso tools. Now, we're going to start with the regular lasso tool, so make sure you select that one, regular lasso tool. And what this is it's basically a freehand drawing tool. It allows you to just click with your mouse and draw whatever kind of squiggly mark you want, and then when you let go, it creates a selection. So it's great because it allows you to freehand any selection you want. You're not stuck with either a rectangle or an ellipse, but on the other hand, it's a little difficult to control it, because with a mouse, at least, you're basically drawing with the equivalent of a bar of soap, right? Computer mice are not exactly the most accurate things in the world. But it does allow you to make sort of rough selections and sort of do things that way. And it certainly has its purpose, right? And these selections, once you let go of the mouse, you get your marching ants, and so these selections work exactly like the rectangular or the elliptical selection, right? I can go up to select, I can go to transform, it sticks a bounding box around it so I can resize it. I can squish it by holding down the shift key on the keyboard. So it works just like any other selection, and of course it makes everything inside the selection active and everything outside inactive. Works exactly the same. All right, so I'm going to deselect, just Command D or Control D. Now, even though the lasso tool is a great freehand tool, it's not the most useful or accurate tool. So we're going to take a look at the polygonal lasso tool. Now, what does that do? Well, that allows you to, again, freehand draw, but with a little more control. So with the polygonal lasso tool, you will click once, and then you'll see that as I'm dragging out the mouse, I get a perfectly straight line, which I can put anywhere I want, and then click again, and then click again, and so on and so forth. And now I can make a pretty accurate selection just by clicking. And if I want to make sure it's a perfectly closed selection, as I hover back to the beginning where I started, you'll see a little tiny circle will pop up next to the polygonal lasso icon. And when I click that, then I get a finished selection made up of a bunch of connected straight lines. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the point of perfectly straight lines if we're talking about a human being who is not made up of straight lines? Well, because if you zoom in far enough and make a bunch of selections from a bunch of tiny little straight lines, you can select anything. So I'm going to grab the polygonal lasso tool. I've zoomed in on her lips here, and I am going to go ahead and very carefully just kind of make a bunch of tiny little straight lines all the way around. Now, one thing I will tell you about the polygonal lasso tool is that it requires, of all the selection tools, probably the most amount of patience, because you're literally carefully tracing something, making a ton of tiny little straight lines. So it definitely requires a bunch of patience. Now, on the other hand, it is also probably the most accurate selection tool because of your ability to zoom in and really get in and do the details of something, right? Now, once we finish outlining her lips here, we are going to feather it, because as you can see as I'm making my way around, sometimes it's a little hard to tell where the edge of certain things are on, for example, a person. Because we are not made up of a bunch of hard edges, we are kind of amorphic. Okay, so again, go back to the beginning, make sure you get that little circle, and boom, now we have a selection of her lips. Now, again, we're going to go up to Select, go to Modify, and Feather. And this time I'm going to knock the feathering up to, say, 3, because I want to make sure we get a nice blurred edge around the lips here, and it will adjust the shape of it. You'll see that it pulled in the edges a little bit for me. And now, again, I can go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and change her lip color. So we can give her, let's go with a nice green lipstick, and we can saturate it a little bit more, and we can bring the color down so it looks a little more realistic. We don't want it to be Joker green, right? Want to make it a little more realistic here, and go ahead and hit OK, and then zoom back and deselect, and now she has green lips. So again, you make really accurate selections this way. Now, of course, the major purpose of making selections is not to do silly things like give people purple eyes and green lips, although that can be fun. It is also to make adjustments that are a little more subtle or realistic, right? We could subtly change her hair color. You could add some coloring to her nails that she might not have had. We could change the color of her shirt. We can select the background and again cut it out so we could put her in front of something else or just have her on a white background. So all of these things allow us to make photographic changes in a way that is accurate and more believable looking than, say, using the eraser tool, which is more of a rough selection tool. Okay, so I am going to stop here and allow you guys to mess around with the selection tools. For now, play around again with the rectangular and the elliptical marquee and the lasso tools. You've got your regular lasso, polygonal, and magnetic lasso. So go ahead and play around with that for a second, and then pause the video, of course, and then come back. I'll wait. Okay, you're back. Did you mess around with those tools? I hope so. Remember, there's a bunch of different photos you can work with. There's the basketball, which is great for playing with the elliptical tool, right? This allows you to select the basketball using the ellipse tool, right? And then once you've made your selection, you can go to select and modify, transform selection, and then go ahead and adjust it so that you get the shape of the ball exactly the way you want it. Now this of course requires patience, right? Make sure you get exactly what you want here. There you go, just adjust it a little bit. And once you feel like you've got the ball chosen right on its edge and you're pretty good with it, then go ahead and hit return. And so that's a great use of the elliptical tool. The ball is chosen. What if I want to get rid of this background? Remember, go to select, go to inverse, and now the background is chosen and not the ball. So I can go ahead now and just hit delete on the keyboard, and the background goes away. Hit deselect, back to the move tool, and now I've got a free floating ball, right? Now, once you've got a free floating item like this, right? We didn't really do this with the photo of the woman, but the basketball lends itself to this really well. So once you've got this free floating item, you can now resize all these pixels that make up the ball so you can make it smaller or not. So you can simply go to your keyboard and do Control or Command T, right? T like Thomas, and that will put a transform box, a bounding box around it. But similar to the bounding box we did with the selection tool, this allows us to resize the ball itself, not just the selection. So if I just grab the corner and resize it, I can make it a smaller ball. If I wanted to, I could hold down the Shift key and stretch it, but I don't really know why you'd want to elongate a basketball, but you get the idea. And you can resize it. And then once you've resized it, hit return. And again, you've got a freestanding ball that you can move around. Another thing you can do with the bounding box, which I didn't show you yet, is if you do Command T, put your bounding box back. So I already showed you how you can resize things with the bounding box, right? But if you hover your cursor outside of the corner of the bounding box, you'll see it becomes this little curved arrow. And if you click and drag that, it allows you to rotate the object. So now the ball spins. Whee! So you can spin the ball around, right? Okay, then hit return. Now, what if I want more than one basketball? Well, you could duplicate your layers, right? Or you could duplicate the pixels themselves. Either way, it's the exact same technique. I'll show you this really quick. Make sure you grab the move tool, right? So you have the move tool, which again, we can pick up the ball and move it around. Now, there is a universal keyboard command for instant duplicate, Okay, this works not only here in Photoshop, but it works in Illustrator, it works in other Adobe products, it even works on Apple computers using folders, files, whatever you want. It's a simple click and drag feature. All you have to do is, with the Move tool chosen, hold down the Option key on your keyboard, and you'll notice that my Move arrow goes from a single black arrow to a double arrow, a black and a white one. And now if I click and drag the basketball, instantly 2 basketballs. Do it again, boom, 3 basketballs. Do it again, boom, 4 basketballs, and so on and so on and so on. And you'll notice over here in the Layers palette that in doing that, it duplicated the layer that the ball was on and gave me 4 layers, 1 for each basketball, right? Now, none of them are named. It just went ahead and named them Layer 0, Copy 1, Copy 2. So make sure you go in and name them for sure once you figure out what you're doing. But this gives you the option to choose different layers, use the bounding box, change the size, right? Go ahead and set it, pick another layer, bounding box, change the size. Again, pick another layer, bounding box, change the size. And then, last but not least, we'll make a bounding box there, and we'll make this guy really small. And we'll put him over here, and let's rotate him a little bit. Right? And now you've got a bunch of balls in space, right? Basketballs floating through the air. So simply by duplicating, resizing, you can have multiples of something. In fact, a lot of times if you look at advertising where there is a lot of one thing in the image, right? Then you're going to see that it's really the same thing, just duplicated over and over again. And maybe it's been rotated or slightly recolored or whatnot. This is an easy way to do that. Now, I said that you can do the same trick both in the work screen and on layers. Same idea. If I were to just choose a layer here, hold down the Option key and drag, I can duplicate the layer this way. This is a little more confusing because it just hides the layer under the previous one, so you see that there's another ball hiding back there. So you can do it either way you want. So that's instant duplicate. We'll use that technique a lot. Okay, so that's it for the beginning of the week lecture. You guys are going to go ahead and with the images I gave you, you're going to start practicing using the elliptical marquee, the rectangular marquee, the 3 different lasso tools, and of course play with the different images that I have in the practice files, and again, make some duplications, resize, and just get used to making selections, cutting things out, and moving stuff around. All right, a little later on, we'll tackle the rest of the selection tools, including the Magic Wand tool and the Direct Select tool in the Quick Mask mode. We'll get to that a little bit later this week. All right, you guys have fun practicing, and I will talk to you soon.